podcast show for business owners and managers who are passionate about developing people and growing a successful business. And now here's your host, Alistair Booth from the HR Booth.
Welcome back to the channel and welcome to this episode, which is on short service terminations. So it's a topic that comes up quite a lot at the HR booth, and probably for anybody that manages people. When I think back to my time in house HR roles where we were given advice around different members of staff, one of the first questions an HR person might ask you is, what's the person's length of service? And the reason for that is, typically speaking, that if anyone has got less than 2 year service, they don't have the automatic right to raise an employment tribunal for unfair dismissal. So it's probably quite a common kind of question that's asked, but also perhaps a bit of a kind of common myth, perhaps, that, if someone has got less than 2 year service, that you can, end their employment very, very quickly. And what we're trying to cover in this episode is that isn't always the case. Now, we'll put kind of detailed notes in the show notes regarding this as well, just in terms of some useful links. But essentially, if someone has got less than 2 year service, generally speaking, unless they can meet specific criteria around the Equality Act or discrimination, then you generally are on safe terms to end their employment. And you don't necessarily have to give a kind of specific reason for that. However, where it becomes a bit of a challenge is that a lot of small businesses, and I guess some large businesses, don't really keep documented records of certain things that can happen. And we've seen this quite often with clients, where you might have someone who's been in the business maybe 9 or 10 months. They've kind of passed the probation period by default because they've not managed that properly. And what's then happened is they've identified that the individual has maybe had like excessive absences, and what they want to do is end that employment. So what they might then do is look at a situation that the employee has less than 2 year service, so we're going to end their employment. However, if the absences are for a specific reason around, perhaps a mental health or a disability, or if it was a woman who may have had absences relating to pregnancy or something that could only affect a woman, then discrimination is going to come into that, and therefore the 2 year service doesn't matter, it won't apply. And quite often that's where employers can become a bit stuck with this, because what happens is they haven't documented the absences. They've perhaps, taken a decision that the individual's got a high absence record, and that's the reason for ending the employment. And if you kind of go down that route, then what you are going to do is find yourself in employment tribunal territory. So quite important to kind of be aware of that. It doesn't always just apply to absence. So you might have a situation where there's a downturn in work, and what you might be looking to do is, rather than go through a kind of complicated or a long drawn out redundancy process, you might decide that we're just going to end the employment for those people with less than 2 year service. But again, if individuals can meet a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, or some other potential reason for that being unfair, then you've got a situation where you could be in employment tribunal territory as well. So, for example, you might have two people doing a job, and you decide to exit someone who has been with you the least amount of time. That person could be a female, and they might have a male counterpart. So that female could then potentially raise a claim around sex discrimination. And again, the 2 year qualifying is taken out of your hands, because that won't apply. So there's lots of different examples where that could happen. So it could be related to, as I say, sex there. It could be related to kind of sexual orientation. There could be age discrimination, and then obviously disabilities discrimination as well. So lots of different kind of factors. So I think the key thing to try and remember is that whilst that 2 year qualifying service is there at the moment, and that is something that is certainly going to change under the Employment Rights Bill, if you are looking to end someone's employment, regardless of their length of service, you should always take HR or legal advice beforehand. So even if someone has got relatively short service and you think on the face of it, it looks quite straightforward just to kind of end employment, I would always advise you to go and take some advice on that before proceeding. And as I said, we'll put some detailed notes in the show notes just to kind of reference some of the points on this. But as I say, good practice to get some independent advice before proceeding. So hopefully you found this episode useful. But key message there is, even if someone has got less than 2 year service, please take some advice before ending their employment. Thank you.